Our mission, and we choose to accept it, is zero injuries and zero environmental impact. A healthy workforce and environment is key to our nation's continued success. The Mission Zero podcast is a deep dive with the industry's top experts into the health, safety, and environmental aspects of today's workplace. Our mission is to be a platform for new ideas and strategies that, when implemented, will improve our safety, our environment, and how we govern out business. We are making the world safer, and we're going to have fun doing it.
Mission Zero podcast. I am your host, Jeff Peoples. Today we are continuing our 10-part now series on human trafficking and slavery. As in the past, we've interviewed both survivors and the people fighting human trafficking. Today, I am very blessed to be interviewing an old friend and now a hero of mine, Grant Gildon. Grant is the Sergeant over Crimes Against Children Unit in Arlington, Texas PD, and also Tarik Muslimovic. I get it?
Perfect.
All right. He is the Sergeant over Human Exploitation and Trafficking for the Arlington, Texas PD. Welcome, guys, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
When you talk, just lean. I want to get a little bit closer. Yeah, lean a little bit closer and lean in when you start talking. But thank you guys so much. There's a lot I want to ask you guys. I think a lot of people would be interested in what you do. I think a lot of people see TV. You know, there's certain SVU crime TV shows that have certain things out there. I'm pretty sure it's pretty accurate, but also it's great to hear from real human beings and what they're doing and everything like that. And like I said beforehand, I normally go through and let everybody tell their life stories, but given we got two guys and you've got a major job and an important job today, I'm going to go ahead and just say, we'll start with you, Grant. I've known you for 25 years. We went to college together, and so love you to death. So this is doubly awesome for me. But post-college, I guess we can start there. What did you do when you got out of college, and what has your career and how's your career path led you to this position you're doing now?
Yeah, after college, after graduating from Texas Tech, went into a completely different field. Went into a field I'd gone to college for, and through various circumstances, a few years later, I found myself back in my hometown of Texarkana, Texas, and was having to take care of some family issues. I had a father that was sick, and I was back there, and found myself needing a job. And Texarkana at the time, there weren't a lot of jobs. And my dad had been a police officer my whole life. It was the one thing I said I would never do, was to be a police officer. But God had other intentions for me. And I went to work for Texarkana, Texas Police Department. And pretty early on in that time, that was in 2003. And early on, I realized that was going to be my calling and that was where I was being led. And from there, though, once I was able to, I'd always kind of wanted to live over in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Had a lot of friends over here. And at the time, for police officers, it was hard to make a living in some of your smaller agencies. And I wanted to get to a bigger agencies with more opportunity to grow. And luckily, God continued to lead me and got me to the Arlington Police Department, where I joined in 2005. And have been here ever since. So coming up in September will be 20 years for me as a police officer. And most of my time with Arlington, I've been either a detective or now a sergeant over an investigative unit. So investigations has really been my life's work as a police officer.
Okay. Tariq?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is a little different. I'm originally from Bosnia. So one thing growing up in kind of the war, one thing I always found comfort in is uniform and police. Those people made me feel safe. I moved to the United States in 1999 when I was 11. And one thing as I was growing up, going through a school system here in Arlington, one thing I was always passionate about is wanted to give back to the community and serve the community where I live at here in Arlington. So when I graduated college, I joined Arlington PD back in 2008. And a little different than Grant's path. I held different positions in my career here at Arlington. From most of them were in a uniform capacity, not investigations. As I had a ambition to promote and become a leader in the department, I was debating what field do I want to go into, and one field that absolutely stuck out to me was the Crimes Against Children unit, because I felt, I want to serve this community, and what better way than serve the most vulnerable population, our children. And so not only was that something that drew me to this position, but then on the second, it was a second angle is it's a challenging unit to manage. Yeah. It's a big unit, and so it allowed me to grow. And so you absolutely got into the Crimes Against Children unit as a sergeant, and then transitioned into the field of human trafficking, as we saw here in our community, and just on a national level, a need for that. And so now I hold this position where we investigate both child exploitation, human trafficking. But so, yeah, that's kind of how it led me from the beginning to now. My purpose, why I'm here, is just wanting to serve these victims, and do what I can to for my detectives to put them in a most advantageous position.
Very cool. And Grant, the current position you have, can you kind of give us the structure behind that? What is the mission, and kind of, I've seen all this, the structure of it, and the amount of full-time people on it. And can you give just an overview of the structure and what you're trying to do from a day-to-day?
Yeah, Jeff, our unit, the Crimes Against Children's unit, we handle what I refer to as the more traditional child abuse cases. Okay. We handle any felony level physical or sexual child abuse. So anything on a sexual abuse side of things, any sexual acts committed against someone under the age of 17 here in Texas, that can be from inappropriate touching to full-on sexual assault. And then on the physical abuse side, anyone 14 or younger who is physically assaulted and injuries caused. A lot of our cases involve serious bodily injury to babies and toddlers, all the way up to handling inappropriate discipline type cases with your older kids. Our unit's made up of 11 full-time detectives. We have one part-time detective, and then we have 2 civilian employees that help with runaways and other clerical duties here with our unit. And then we have 2 sergeants. So the 2 units that we're going to discuss today, we're going through a transition right now. We just recently split into the 2 units, but traditionally here we handle about 1,400 felony child abuse cases a year. And so very busy. Our detectives all carry caseloads, anywhere 30s to 40s active cases at any one time. And so very, very busy. And I'd spent 9 years as a detective in the unit before moving on to homicide years ago, and just came back, I guess about a year and a half ago as a supervisor. And it's just an area where I've always felt a calling, and it's a part that I didn't want to go a full career without having worked in this field and try to do what I could to help these victims. Like my partner here said, is the most vulnerable victims in our society. And what I have found is, I believe it's one of the biggest trouble areas in our society. So it's something we take a lot of honor, and we're very humbled that these victims trust us to try and help them. And it's something that we fight towards every day.
And Tariq, your position's a little bit different than his. You're more focused on the human trafficking side. Can you just give an overview of what your department does and what your day-to-day or what your mission is, rather, is a better question?
Absolutely. So our mission is to focus on human trafficking, both the child and the adult victim. Mm-hmm. And along the lines of human trafficking, we also investigate child exploitation. Now, that is a blanket statement, right? It entails and includes many offenses. We investigate everything from possession of child pornography and promotion of child pornography to online solicitation of minors. And what we have learned is that under the child exploitation umbrella, we see a lot of crossover that goes into the trafficking. Everything from grooming, everything from exploiting victims online that carries over to contact offenses in person. When we formed this unit, it was important for me and our agency to see that we keep those together, human trafficking and child exploitation. We operate on both a proactive and a reactive approach. So we do plenty proactive operations out in the field, and then certainly reactively. If our patrol officers contact us, we respond to the field and begin the investigation. If it's maybe Child Protective Services contacting us, it could be a anonymous tip coming in. But then the last piece that we do is community awareness. As human trafficking that continues to grow and it continues to become, I don't want to necessarily say a buzzword, but it's certainly flooding our media. It is important that we serve our community and prepare our community to recognize it. So a big portion of our unit is just going out there to various different community events and just talking about it. We're formed as a unit of 5 full-time detectives and myself as the supervisor of the unit. And I think it's important to mention 4 of those detectives focus strictly on case investigations, while my 5th detective is strictly working on forensic analysis. In today's age, Jeff, as you probably know, everybody has a cell phone, and the criminal mindset is they're going to conduct their criminal activity on their cell phones and computers. And as we look into the internet crimes against children era, man, that is just so demanding that we have a expert that can take a cell phone and do an extraction and give me the data that I need to make a successful case. So that is kind of how we're formed. And we lead everything from a victim-centered approach, because as Grant talked about this, I came from the crimes against children unit previously. We work under the multidisciplinary umbrella, but I believe the reason we're so successful is we focus on the victim, and I think if you put the victim first, at the end of the case, you're gonna have a lot of success.
Well, you just touched on a lot of stuff that I plan to ask about, so that that was great. But so my involvement in this began when I learned about the problem, the size of the problem, and just how big it is. And as we were discussing before we started recording, society doesn't know. Is not clued in on just how awful this is, how grand it is in scale, and I think the education needs to be there, but we also have to find ways to talk to people that don't want to hear about it. And I've spoken to people, and I can see their eyes glossing over, and they're kind of shrieking back a little bit because it's an incredibly tough subject. And so I guess the first question, I'll ask both of you. You both can answer and throw in your answer there. But Tarik, what would you, the people that are, that don't know anything about this or haven't even thought about human trafficking, how big is it? How big of a problem is it?
Well, Jeff, it's big. And I think what makes human trafficking so dangerous, especially as we talk about it here in 2023, is it's often, I always mention this when I have the opportunity to talk, it's a crime that hides in plain sight. And what I mean by that is internet has taken over. And what we have seen is these suspects utilize the internet and social media platforms and various websites where they can conceal and hide behind these electronic devices. I'm not saying we don't see victims walking the streets and being forced into walking what they call the blade or a strip and forced into sex trafficking there. It certainly happens, and especially in bigger cities. But what we have seen here in our local communities is it's all done online. And so I think unless law enforcement intervenes, it's not going to get stopped. So it is big. There's a magnitude of that by just the purity of it being concealed. Mm-hmm. And I think as we see movies, as we see TV, and as we see shows talk about trafficking, it is our responsibility on the investigative side to educate our community. And so to make sure we have a understanding of what it is. It is not always that victim that's chained to a bed. Mm-hmm. Some of our victims go to school, mm-hmm. they go to work, and then they're forced to return back to their trafficker. And I think that's a very real possibility that can happen.
Yeah, the one thing I learned very quickly was that the scene from the movie Taken, where the girl is walking down the street and a van pulls up and throws a pillowcase over her head, is really not how it works. It's a long grooming process, and it's done very manipulative, and it's done very with a strategy, right? It's to groom them over time. It doesn't happen immediately, and next thing they know, they're in the life, and it's almost impossible to get out. Grant, we read the information today that when the grooming starts and when the I guess the age of these young girls, for the most part young girls, but from what I understand, it's rising with young boys as well as in the new society. What do you think? How to answer this? It goes all the way from, but babies. Let's be honest, and it's a tough thing to say, but the average age in Arlington for beginning of this problem, what do you think it is? I mean, is it?
Well, and like you said, the grooming will start very, very young.
Yeah.
The thing most people don't understand is for a lot of our victims, they don't know anything other than the cycle that they're in.
Yes.
So to them, they believe it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
So oftentimes, a lot of our cases, we don't get what we refer to as outcries till much later when they're older and they're exposed to more things in the world and they realize that what they've gone through is not what normal childhood development is supposed to involve.
Mm-hmm.
For us, a lot of our cases do start from the moment kids can talk, from the moment kids are starting to develop as toddlers, the grooming will start. Most of our cases will involve prepubescent kids. And as you mentioned, it's growing. The number of cases involving boys is growing. And I think it's always been there. I think what we're starting to see is society is starting to allow those kids to be comfortable in making outcries. I think those cases have always been there. It's just so many of our young men have grown up because of the stigma of it, and they've held it in all their lives. A lot of times.
It's more embarrassing to them.
It is. I think child abuse, the overwhelming issue of child abuse, is the largest plague on our society, even larger than drugs, in my opinion, because it's happening within our homes. It's happening in every aspect of our society.
What percentage of victims, perpetrators were relatives?
A very high percentage, a very, very high percentage. I don't have a number. It's been a while since I've checked some of the national numbers. A lot of your child advocacy centers, much like the building that we're in today, our RCAC, has those numbers that they can put out nationally. In your hometown of Houston, the Children's Assessment Center is a fabulous organization that helps thousands and thousands of kids. And I know there's a lot of numbers available, but for us, the majority of our cases, it's a known offender. Oftentimes within their own, either their home or their trusted circle of family and friends. And that is what makes it so hard. Is it's the people that you least expect. We have cases in Arlington where it's the stranger danger, as I'm sure I grew up with stranger danger. I'm sure you did too.
Absolutely.
And as someone who has been involved in cases like the Amber Hagerman case and different things, that's still a part of our society, but that is a very, very small piece of it. Child abuse spreads across any and all demographics within our society. It doesn't matter poverty or not, race, sexual orientation. It doesn't matter what it is. Child abuse happens.
Tariq, do you think you have the resources you need? I was listening to what you said about your detectives. You got 30 to 40 active, and I might have been Grant said that, but 30 to 40 active cases per detective. Is that overwhelming? That sounds overwhelming.
Well, it certainly does. And I think it's fair to say it is.
Yeah.
I think, just like any agency, I think our agency tries to put us in a position to be successful. In this position right now, in my current role, we're evaluating those bases daily, right? Monthly and quarterly, and seeing how are we managing these cases. And it is my responsibility to gauge the proactive efforts to ensure that imagine cases being served into you on a platter where now you have to serve every one of those victims. And if you keep taking on more and more and more, well, what you're doing is you're putting those other victims behind and pushing them back. And that does us no good, right? So we need to ensure that we're focusing and serving every one of those victims, which in result represents every one of those cases. I'm the kind of guy that will always say, "Give me more," right?
Yeah.
Because to me, the more I can receive on a resource level, that means I can serve more victims and I can put more bad guys in jail. So I'll be the guy who always says that. I'll give me more. But I mean, I think with the trend that we're seeing, there's a rise in the crime. The internet alone, it will keep us busy. So we do what we can with what we have, and I'm very fortunate to have a very talented group of detectives that are subject matters in this field.
Mm.
I didn't have to train any of these detectives. We hit the ground running with this unit, and I think at the end that's what keeps them successful and keeps us afloat.
Okay, so that's when I started this podcast 2 years ago, and one of the greatest benefits is learning how to listen, because I used to be the guy that would sit there and just wait for you to finish talking so I could say what I wanted to say. So now I'm a much better listener than I used to be. Now, you've mentioned the internet 3 times, so that's obviously the crawl on your side. And that was something I was going to ask you about, because one thing in addition to educating the public or the listeners about the realities of this situation, also preventative measures and what to look out for. And you listen to my podcast with Dominique. Dominique gives great advice at the end of that podcast, and it was wildly deep communication with your children. Don't let anything be private. So, I guess absolutely the online. And it changes a lot, right? And it's about to change even more with AI. So being up to date on that and having people at the very forefront of that knowledge in your department is absolutely necessary, right? So your online activity, what are some of the things that's going on online? Like what types of apps are criminals using? What type of web pages or anything I'm not even mentioning? What are they using out there to draw young people into this?
Well, Jeff, when I say the internet, I think I speak for every single social media platform that exists to mankind. And as we speak, there's a developer creating a new one. When you focus on, and I'm not throwing these companies or these applications under the bus. I mean, it is because social media is very powerful. I think if used in the proper content and its intended use, I think it's phenomenal. But we have recovered victims, identified victims, and identified suspects in almost every single gaming platform out there, and also social media platform out there. It's as I mentioned, it's continuing to grow. But when we look at often, not only do we battle social media platforms that we know to the big ones like Instagram, your Facebooks, Snapchats, and things along those lines. Now there's internet phones, voice over phones that we have to look at. And yes, there's so much of that what in result, what that does for us is just slows us down, because now we have to pay more legal process in order to get into those investigations. The biggest thing I always encourage is we need to ensure, especially for our youth, that parents have a good pulse on what their kids are doing online. Because if you think about it, that any platform online that whether the child is using to communicate can potentially result in the child being a victim. And unfortunately, if you go back to 2020, when our kiddos were left at home, everybody was given a Surface Pro or a MacBook or some form of communication device that they can continue learning on a distance level. It exposed the victims even further. So it's a growing trend, unfortunately. But again, we're working with our folks and within various different task forces to kind of curb this problem, educate folks, educate parents, to just know what your kid is doing. And if you're an adult, let me show you what it looks like if you're being groomed, and what those dangers look like.
I want you to expand on that in a minute, Bob. But first, I want to really, I guess, one thing you said there, gaming. I guess the old fuddy-duddies like me that how is it happening through gaming? I don't think a lot of older people would understand that.
Well, there's multiple different apps that your kids buy to game, and whether it's let me put it this way, and the simplest way, because there's so many out there. One thing I will say, if there's a way for a child to communicate with another child through a text format on a gaming, you can even use the big platforms like PlayStation. your Microsoft Xbox. If there's a means to communicate, often what we see is the grooming cycle begin there, and they'll take it off of that platform, then they'll move it to a social media platform. Maybe the child will produce the suspect with their Snapchat account, and then it'll go from Snapchat account, it will go to a cell phone number. And so that's often what we see. We don't often see the criminality remain on the gaming sites too long, but that's usually where it starts, or that's where the offender meets the victim.
Okay. Yeah. That's kind of the information I was looking to draw out, because that I didn't know that about gaming. I guess I kind of figured it would happen amongst Instagram and things like that, because they have access to you. And I look at mine. I've got a niece that's a teenager, preteen, and she has an Instagram account, and I'm sitting there. I've noticed myself looking, going, okay, what is there anything weird, that I'm looking for here? And and Grant, you can answer this question as well if it pertains to you. What apps are there some apps that are used more, or is there something that you would particularly warn parents against?
I always talk about the big ones, because those are the most common ones. Your Snapchats, your Instagrams, your Facebooks. I mean, we see that Facebook, that platform itself, is not very commonly used amongst teens as much, but Snapchat is one of the bigger, more popular ones. And when I really say warn, I mean, these are some great platforms, right? But used appropriately. Grant talked about stranger danger before, and I think stranger danger is still something we need to educate our children on. But I also tell parents, well, when you let your teenage kiddo or even younger go into the bedroom with their cell phone, you're almost inviting that stranger into that bedroom every single night. You just have to make sure that you're supervising that. And those platforms are great. If there's no control, no oversight, it can become dangerous very quickly. We've seen those things escalate from meeting the offender the same day, to already plans being made to meet in person the same day. And because these suspects are so good at finding the vulnerability out of these victims.
And one thing I would say that a lot of people don't realize, a lot of these different online apps and online sites, the companies are not based in the United States. Now, as someone that travels the world the way you do, you know that not all laws are the same as in the U.S. So from an investigative standpoint, a lot of times it's hard for us, because some of these companies don't have to abide by our search warrants and our legal process. So a lot of
consent is probably different.
Yes, it's very different. And so from an investigative standpoint, being able to obtain a lot of the information is oftentimes harder with some of these sites, because they're in a different country and going by a different set of laws, and it makes it very difficult.
Okay, I'm going to look into that on my own to see which countries if they're targeting certain countries, so they can avoid, because our diplomatic relations matter, right? And if it's a country like if it's England or Switzerland, of course, we can get a lot of feedback from that. But if it's some of these third world countries that don't necessarily have a lot of government relations with ours, it must be tough to get it out of there.
The hardest thing, much like we said earlier, there's a lot of these companies that spend a lot of money and a lot of efforts with their law enforcement side. There's, a lot of them work great with us. They do everything they can to provide assistance. But as soon as one company becomes harder for the abuser, a new company is ready, a new site, a new app is ready to come into the fold. So it's something that the hard part for us is making sure our detectives are trained and up to date on all the new trends. And that's a never ending cycle.
Yeah. Do you guys do proactive and I guess the only thing I could think to even compare it to was the Chris Hansen, is it Chris Hansen TV show?
Yes.
Do you guys do things like that?
We don't on our side. There's a lot of, over the time that I've been involved with child abuse investigations, a lot of things similar to that. There's been problems at prosecution, and
I'd imagine
the big thing for us, our detectives know when they come to work, that we have two expectations for them. If you ask any of our detectives what the expectation is for them today, they will tell you that they know they have to do anything and everything that they possibly can for the victims in our cases. That's number one. If CPS needs help, you help them. If our counselors that are working with the kids after they make outcries, if they need help, you help them, because that's what helps each victim overcome the trauma that they've suffered. And the second expectation is you have to put offenders and abusers in prison, and you have to put them in prison for decades. That's the way we keep them from abusing the next generation. And so it's very important for our detectives to be able to win in court. And so that we put a premium on that. And I'm very lucky. We're all very lucky here that we have some phenomenal detectives. Some of the most veteran and experienced detectives in this department are right here in the Crimes Against Children's unit. And the easy part for us is to let them go work their cases, because they do great work. The hard part, we mentioned caseloads and things earlier, is wanting to make sure that they're still whole for their families.
I'm going to get to that.
So,
I'm going to ask that question here in a little bit. So table that. One question I do want to ask you: what would you tell? I guess what would you tell parents to, so you're more about child victims, Tariq, you're more focused on trafficking. What, Grant, would you tell parents to look out for? Because like we said, the numbers I've seen is something between 80 and 90% or someone in the know, a family member or someone that's the perpetrator. What would you tell parents to look for as far as signs that this is going on?
First off, we have to get past the stigma of talking about sex with our kids, talking about abuse with our kids. Statistical data will tell you if your kids go to school, if your family attends a church, if your kids play an extracurricular activity, you are around both child abuse victims and child abusers on a daily basis. You're around them all the time. They're in it doesn't matter if you are very wealthy and go to a very good school, or if you're, dealing with poverty and you're in a lower income area, you deal with these issues. So what I would tell parents, and I'm in the same position as a parent right now with the age of my kids, you have to have conversation. Much like some of your guests in the past have talked about, nothing can be off limits. And you can't make jokes about it or things. You have to refer to parts of your body that are private. You have to refer to boundaries within both your family and outside your family. And your kids have to know that if someone is talking to them about something inappropriate or making them feel uncomfortable, that they have to feel like they can come to you, so you can prevent these things from happening. But first, we have to accept that this is the world we live in, and that our kids are vulnerable.
Exactly right. You can't battle the world you hope or wish you lived in. It's the world we actually live in. And God bless my parents, they did not talk about sex either, at all. And so I know they loved me, and I know they were great humans. But you're right, most people don't. And if my parents would have come to me and even approach sex, I would have come out of my skin. I mean, it just didn't work. So, you're right. That's again, my first interview, Dominique, she gives a lot of advice about that, and she says just that you got to talk about it all. Tariq, as far as the trafficking generally begins around the average age of 14 years old, the grooming process, right? And so, my question for Grant was more about the in-home abuse or maybe school abuse or something like that from smaller children. My question for you is, children of the grooming processing age, what should parents be looking for as far as warning signs that may be happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So it all starts with, I think, monitoring some of the inappropriate language and how it's being discussed, and what is your child talking about online. And I think as anybody that's a parent can look at how they may have a standard on what they deem to be appropriate or inappropriate language by their child or what they're using. Jeff, when we look at back in the day when we were in school, in grade school, I think it was appropriate to exchange little love notes with girls and small little messages we passed around the classroom until the teacher catches you, right? Well, now what we see is, since every child has a cell phone in the classroom, now we see nude images being shared amongst the students. And that is a growing issue that we're seeing in schools. That is something that we're seeing not just in schools, but outside of schools when kids are what they believe to be meeting somebody online, to be somebody their same age. But in reality, that perpetrator is falsifying to be a 14-year-old girl or boy. They're actually a 50-year-old male somewhere else. And unfortunately, we see a lot of sextortion when these victims do start sharing images, nude images. That's when they will start threatening the child for monetary funding. If you don't send me money, I'm going to expose all these images. So that is there's an uptick in that now. And so kind of back to your question, I think the big thing is, as I mentioned this previously, is we need to ensure that we're keeping an eye on their platforms, these social media platforms, the text messages. But the key is having an open relationship with your child, talking to them. If your kid comes to you and says, Mom or Dad, I did something I wasn't supposed to do, I shared some inappropriate images. Although we know, as a parent, I think you would just want to twist off and be so upset and so hurt. The importance is to understand that your child did something very courageous. They own their mistake and they're hurt. They're a victim for being exploited on that regard. So report that crime and let us begin investigating it. And let us see if we can find some resources for your kiddo so this doesn't happen again. I think it's just having those open discussions. We always talk about 16-year-olds now. It's time for them to start driving. We don't just toss them a set of keys to a brand new car and be like, "Hey, go drive." We don't. They learn how to drive. They learn what a car is, how to brake, how to accelerate, how to turn. There's classes for that. Social media needs to be treated the same way. Anything online needs to be treated the same way. We need to educate our kids. Parents need to sit down and tell them, okay, so I'm going to allow you to be on social media, but these are the parameters. And have that trust with their children to be able to experience it, but with some boundaries.
Is there, and this may be a laughable question to you as both as parents, but is there some type of monitoring phones? Are parents somehow able to see everything that comes to a phone? Is there something that allows that, and a computer as well, right? Is there some kind of app or program that you recommend?
There won't be anything that will control everything, right? I think there are some parental controls, but I think if somebody with the intent to overcome those blocks, so to speak, they can kids are smart nowadays, let's be honest, and they know how to circumvent that process. There are various different apps on the online that parents can call, research and get on and install in a kid's phone, but they're only as good as that relationship between the child and the parent, right? Because they can get a new phone and the parent doesn't know about that, and it does nobody any good. They can create a new app, the new username, and so there's a lot of that. I think the biggest control, or let me rephrase that, the biggest oversight is an open and honest communication with your child, and building the blocks from there.
Yeah, I hope parents that are listening and actually interested in how they can do better or are listening to the series. That's the theme. I mean, that's it. It's not, like you said, there's always going to be a new app, and but the communication, and removing the stigma of speaking about sex to your children, and that. Grant, I too have read the stats on that, not just in that single instance of abuse, but also it develops a better adult more often than not. Like they're much more responsible sexually as they grow into adults if there's an open communication with your parents about it.
Right. And I think just in general, our kids, their knowledge is so much more advanced right now. They've been exposed, whether in healthy, not criminal aspects, they've just been exposed to so much more in the world. Pornography, TV is different. Everything's different now. It's something that the slippery slope has gone a lot farther. And for me, I grew up in a small town where every one of my friends, our parents had grown up friends, our grandparents were even friends. And so you couldn't go anywhere or do anything without being around people that knew you well, knew your parents. And, you know, for me, having a father in law enforcement, it was just something I was always used to. And I was sheltered. I didn't realize how sheltered I was until I got out of my hometown and saw different parts of the world and people from different areas. But now, you know, I've got my oldest is of an age where he's one of the few in his group of friends that doesn't have his own cell phone, and he thinks it's terrible. But I just am not going to allow that until I know that he's aware of the responsibility that comes with having a chance to communicate with people all over the world.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tariq.
You know, Jeff, you mentioned earlier one question you had about some of the proactive measures that we may take here in Arlington, and one of them you brought up was to Chris Hansen. I believe you're referring to How to Catch a Predator.
Yes, sir.
One of the things on my side of the house in our unit we do those proactive operations. And one thing I always find amazing when we go and portray ourselves in the undercover role as a child, when we begin interacting with adults, okay, that are seeking out a child to have sex with, we learn a lot from that, and we learn a lot from that in our platforms like that when we conduct these chats, just so we see where the mindset is at. What we learn often is these suspects and how cautious they are. They try to think multiple steps ahead in an attempt to prevent from being caught. So often when we can go back to the community and speak to parents and educate them, hey, this is what to look for. The vulnerability aspect I mentioned earlier is one, but it's, again, always it ties back to having that conversation with your child and having some kind of control when they're home alone. Often than not, we portray ourselves to be home alone. And these suspects, the way they engage us about, how does your mom monitor your phone? Is your mom going to see what you're saying right now? Make sure you delete these messages immediately. So those levels of grooming, and they're always thinking ahead. And we learned that, unfortunately, from real suspects. Now, we're fortunate that they're talking to an undercover police officer, not an actual victim. But we need to take those steps every single time, and then continue building and educating to almost like getting in the mindset of those suspects and seeing how we can prevent that.
And I'm sure, and Grant, I think you were hinting at this, but the increased sexualization of children in society probably is damaging your efforts quite a bit, because it's becoming, you know, there's people out there trying to make it normal. Well, I mean, and it's just going to keep going in that direction. So, and also, I think, and I think you guys would agree, as far as the victims, and we're talking about parents, you know, talking to their children, and that's from good homes. Most of these victims don't come from good homes because they're easier targets to manipulate and to groom. Right? Would you guess, like, I guess this is more a Tariq question, but of the amount of trafficked young men and women, what percentage do you think they come from broken homes or in situations where abuse already exists?
Oh, it's very high. It would be hard for me to put a number on it, but it is certainly high. And often we see our victims coming from foster homes, from where they've been placed somewhere, and it's the cycle where they're awarded to the state, and it's like you mentioned, broken homes. But I mean, you know, it's always get asked, like, about what's one thing that we need. Well, we need a lot more good foster parents, patient foster parents, and foster homes. You know, that is one thing that we need. Writing a check on something doesn't always solve, equipment doesn't solve my problems. It's just we need more and better homes. So you're absolutely right, Jeff. There is that. But you've also mentioned it can happen in a good home. It can happen in, Grant mentioned on this earlier, it's both child abuse and human trafficking. Those types of crimes don't discriminate. I've gone to small towns where it's like, no, it's impossible. It doesn't happen here. And I'll log in and I'll show them multiple active ads, sex ads, where I believe that those are trafficking victims.
Yeah, I learned Backpage
Yes.
I've heard that from two different
Yep.
people I've talked to as an organization or as a website that's very much involved in that, and it's kind of used as a conduit to make that happen. Yeah. So again, Tariq, you love to answer my questions that I was going to be coming up with. Both of you, and I realize both of you gentlemen, you work for the government, right? And so if this is a question you really can't be honest about, please feel free. But what is you mentioned needing foster homes? What is the greatest thing that's kind of damaging your efforts, and what do you need the most to make your efforts better?
That is a question where it's about listing all the things and prioritizing what's at the top of the list. I think you have to understand how many of these cases, when you look at it within the family dynamic for us, it's a cycle that's gone through generations. So having
real quick, I'm sorry, yeah. So I don't forget this question. Do you find that victims often become perpetrators? Is that real?
I think there's an argument to be made there. I don't. Let me say this: nowhere near do all victims become perpetrators at all. I will tell you that over the last 15 years, I don't know how many thousands of child abusers I've interviewed and talked with, but a theme that happens a lot is they will. One of the things we talk with them about is we allow a minimization of their intent. Okay. Oftentimes they want to explain that they weren't trying to hurt the child, is how these conversations start. It's very common for us to get into any abuse that the offender had suffered as a child. And a lot of times they detail abuse within their home and abuse towards them. But I will tell you, Jeff, in all of these thousands of conversations, not once have I ever had an offender tell me they were abused as a kid and they didn't know it was wrong then, and they knew what they were doing to a child as an offender. They knew it was wrong what they were doing. They understand and accept that what happened to them was wrong, and then they've made the choice to continue that cycle against another child. And so it comes back to acknowledging not the world we wish we lived in, but the world we actually live in. You mentioned earlier a lot of the kids that come from broken homes. It's why our teachers are so important. Our school officials are so important.
I didn't think about that. I bet they're really helpful in the front line of this.
We get a large number of our outcries come towards school staff, comes from people that are involved in extracurricular activities for kids, coaches and band directors, a lot of different areas. But what we have to do, oftentimes the process is not played out the way we need it for us to be able to address the issues with those kids, help them with the trauma they've suffered, and then also be able to prosecute. We're in the business of prosecuting people that prey on kids. So I think educating, having a plan in place. We have some organizations here locally that I know they do extensive background checks with anyone that's going to be around their kids. They have plans in place where even if you as a parent are teaching or around a group of kids, you're not even able to be alone with your kid while at their facility. And some people think that's extreme, but here's the good part of it. If someone is coming to that organization with ill intent, they're going to move on. They're going to see that they have a plan in place to do everything they can to prevent a subject who's preying on kids from entering the doors. And that is important. And then understand, people think that kids lie about these types of things, and that if they say they were abused, they must just not understand. And so oftentimes they don't report what kids tell them. What I have found throughout all my years is the number one thing that a child needs to be able to overcome the trauma that they've suffered is for one person to believe them. Just one person to believe them and to help make them safe. So if a child comes to you, it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, if you're working at the Starbucks and a kid tells you that someone is trying to hurt them or that someone is being inappropriate, just tell them, I believe you, and try to help make them safe in that moment. And kids are very resilient.
You know, I learned from the I guess the process of recovery from an organization called the Redeemed House. It's a recovery home in Houston, and they taught me so much, you know, and it was eye opening. But you know, one of the things I learned is that the trauma, because of the age of development when this begins, they don't really, they'll never. They don't teach them to try to get rid of the trauma. They can't. Mm-hmm. They teach them the reaction to the trauma. But that takes mental health professionals.
Yes.
And I can't imagine we have enough.
Jeff, the reason why earlier in our conversation I told you that I believe child abuse is the largest plague on our society is because of what you just mentioned. Mm. It stays with these kids long after the abuse stops. It affects how they raise their kids. It affects every relationship that they will ever have. And it affects their ability to go on with life. I've taught law enforcement professionals, police officers all over the country. And there has not been a single time, not one time, that I have taught a class to law enforcement professionals about child abuse where somebody in the class didn't either come up to me afterwards or call me on the phone and tell me how difficult it was because they were abused as a child and had never told anyone.
And people are also very worried to falsely accuse somebody.
Very much.
Right. That's a concern, right? And so they don't want to, once your name gets attached to that, it's, even if it didn't happen, it's hard to erase it, right? And so that's always a tough thing to get over as well.
I think if people knew more about the process, first off, it's not hard. I mean, it's a very hard process to prosecute somebody, okay? And nowadays here in Arlington, and it's very similar to other areas across the country, we work in what's called a multidisciplinary team. So every child abuse case that comes in, there's a team of professionals, not just police, that work the various aspects. And our team is made up of law enforcement, Child Protective Services, the Child Advocacy Center, the Alliance for Children here, which is made up of your forensic interviewers, your counselors, your support resource staff, Cook's Children's Medical Center in Fort Worth, our care team there, our medical professionals, and then the district attorney's office. We all work together. We staff every case together. We get various opinions on all of these aspects and then come to a decision on how to move forward. And so the biggest thing is if a child comes to you and says that they've been abused or they've been hurt, understanding that your role is not in that moment to judge and decide what happened. It's to protect that child and let them know that someone is there and wants to simply make them safe. Mm-hmm. And then you have a lot of professionals that will check into that and determine. But first we have to accept that we have to do that because these things are happening all around us. As far as needing more resources, there's so much more we could do and so much more that we must do to protect our kids.
Gotcha. Tariq, where does DFW rank as far as nationally, globally, as a hotbed for trafficking?
Well, it's very popular only because we're kind of in the heart of Texas, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the major arteries that travel through up and down, east and west, we often find victims from multiple states across, both north and south. And so I think as you probably know, Jeff, these victims and their perpetrators and their suspects in the trafficking game, they travel. And that's why when I mentioned, you may be living in a small suburb town near DFW and you may be in denial that this is happening. Well, I can tell you it is happening in your towns because as these traffickers travel with their victims, they get tired of driving. So they're going to crash the first motel that they see, and then maybe a small town, a very small population. Big metroplexes like DFW attract that kind of business because the demand, right? We have a demand of Johns going onto these various websites and wanting to hire sex workers. And if we didn't have the demand, we wouldn't have a trafficking problem. Sure. And so that is it is one of our focuses. We focus on the demand suppression. We want to keep these suspects accountable because it is a crime. It is a felony crime in Texas. And so anytime you have big metroplexes, the areas like DFW, Houston, and then if you go far on the East Coast, your Miami's, they're going to be large. And I mean, it's bigger cities, obviously, that's what Grant mentioned earlier. Bigger cities do have resources in place to combat these cases, investigations. We're fortunate because here in DFW, not only do we have a multitude of task forces that we are a part of here in Arlington that we rely on heavily to combat trafficking, we have a lot of nonprofit organizations that also pour out their heart and souls to serve these victims. And really, none of this would be possible, Jeff, without those people, without our awesome task force partners, without our awesome nonprofit organizations, our advocates. Because I can sit here and talk to a victim all day long about what just happened to them. It will never be as powerful as if I'm sitting in the room, myself, a detective, and now an advocate. Somebody a survivor who's been in their shoes before. It's going to trump everything I have to say because that person next to me has experienced it. And so as bad as it sounds that we have a rise here in the DFW, we're also situated and equipped with the proper resources to combat that.
Do you get cooperation from federal agencies?
Yes, sir. So one of the task forces that we are part of is I have two detectives that are part of that are task force officers with Homeland Security investigations. So we're intertwined with the federal organization like in that regard, and that allows us a lot of good things, right? Because it not only allows us to take cases on a state level to prosecute them that way, it allows us to prosecute cases on a federal level. And we kind of pick and choose. We work and staff cases with our partners to see which is the best way we can proceed forward with this case to get the maximum punishment and have the most successful result at the end. So HSI has been a phenomenal partner of ours.
Great. We're going to be close to wrapping this up because I know you guys got to get to work. You both have children, right?
I do not.
Okay, so
I do.
So you do, and but I don't either. But you and I still understand, Tariq, that crimes against children is the most heinous in the world, right? And so you guys you and your investigators have to see this from a day-to-day basis. How, and Grant, I'll let you answer this first. How do you personally maintain a good mental outlook and not let this kind of wear on you too much? I don't know how to describe it, but you know what I mean. How do you prevent it from yourself, and how do you help your officers from having that happen to them?
Yeah, and Jeff, I think I do better today than I did 10 years ago. Learning how things affected me. I think for me, I've been very blessed to have my family, to have my faith, having my church family's always provided me a lot of strength. The things that my wife has had to put up with and deal with over the years is something that oftentimes gets lost in all of this. The hours that we keep both in this unit, and then for me, I spent a number of years in the homicide unit, and I was gone all the time. I was always working and was not home with my kids. And so the burdens that we put on our families are oftentimes very large. And as my family will tell you, sometimes the hardest thing is not when dad's gone, but when dad's home and still not fully there.
Yes.
And that's what can be very hard to understand for your kids and your families.
They will later in life.
They will later.
But they won't right now.
But you also, I think at this stage of my life, I realized how much I was missing. And that becomes very difficult to to deal. That's a burden that we have to bear. So for me, it was very difficult as a detective in this unit. I was a detective for 9 years in the unit, was lead on thousands of cases. And the hardest part of that, I told you what our caseloads are, and we have more resources here than a lot of places do. Okay. I mean, our department has made crimes against children a priority over the years to try and help this. But oftentimes the toughest decision is that you're having to prioritize, you're having to triage cases. And so every time you try to help a victim, there's someone else who's waiting for help that you're not getting to at that moment. And
it
that
kills you inside.
It does. It does. And our detectives, when they wake up in the middle of the night, they know there's a victim somewhere who wants their help.
That burden.
And it's always there. So as coming back to this unit as a sergeant, as the supervisor, one of the biggest goals I had was trying to help the detectives and making sure that we're keeping them whole for their families. And I think, we're asking more of our detectives, more of police officers in general than ever before. It is harder to do this job today than at any point in the history of police work, and especially of child abuse investigations. It's very difficult. And for our detectives, I tell them all the time, it's their job to work on behalf of the victims. And I believe it's my job to work on behalf of them and try to make sure that our decisions are pointing them in a direction that we think they can do the most good. And then accepting some of that burden that they feel, letting them know it's not all on them. It's decisions that we're making to lead them in a direction, and that they're doing all that they can do. We could always do more.
Yeah. What you guys are senators. You've heard of that before? Senators? That's what you are. You have to take on that burden for other people so you can protect other people. You take it on, and that's remarkable. Tariq, same question for you. How do you deal with seeing the awfulness and the horrific things that you see, and how do you help your people to cope with that?
Well, absolutely. You kind of mentioned earlier, I don't have any kids, right? So I'll view things from a different perspective. But I have obviously nieces, I have cousins, I have young family members. We touched on this earlier. You may not be a parent, but you're around kids all the time,
Absolutely.
right? And those are your motivating forces to go out there and do a good job, to lead a team and serve your community. One thing on a personal level that kind of keeps me grounded the most is my wife. She's just as a heart of gold. She's a servant mindset. And so when it's a 1 o'clock in the morning call out, or if I'm missing dinner, or if the phone is constantly ringing, she understands, because she knows there's a greater good behind that. Yes, she'll miss me for a couple hours or maybe a day, but I'm out there doing something that she also is fully vested in helping. And for our detectives, you mentioned this, and that is so important, because I'd argue that in law enforcement, policing, you could be a patrol officer, you may drive up to the first fatality accident and you see a dead body. That is terrible. That is something that will be ingrained for you for the rest of your life. But when you escalate that another level higher, now you're dealing with this type of content that is so sensitive. My detectives are exposed to very sensitive content like child pornography. I mean, some of the most horrific images and videos you can probably imagine. It is somebody that wants to be in this position, has a major passion to stopping it. And that is what I'm dealing with, those types of detectives. I always make a point to thank their family members for allowing their, their spouses to come over here and serve and allow me to lead them, because they're also gone and work long hours. Our department has done an incredible job, Jeff, to have resources available. And I think that not only for supervisors, but for our first line detectives, to recognize those early intervention if something is not right, because we want to ensure that we have the best cadre of detectives here to serve those people, serve our community. And, it's okay to have a bad day. We just need to be able to have a door wide open, arms wide open approach. Hey, come and talk to me. Because when I go home, I know I have that with my wife. I have that with my family members. I know what I've overcome in my life to get where I'm at now.
Mhm.
And so those are the kind of what things that keep me grounded.
Okay.
To give those kids another chance, another option. As we all know, life is all about choices,
Mhm.
and just kind of steering our youth and our adults to make those right choices.
Being a veteran, I always make a post on Veterans Day, and I make very clear note to say, don't just thank the veteran, thank the wives, the spouses, the children, because they served as well, and that applies to you guys as well. Your spouses and children are serving as well, because they're having to sacrifice you and your time in order to serve the community, and that's important that they realize their sacrifice is important as well, and they're a part of it. Well, gentlemen, that's all I had for you as far as questions. You two guys are public servants and absolute heroes. I applaud the work you do. It's amazing. I'm so thankful for you. Society is so thankful for you, and I thank you for taking time out of your day. I know you got here pretty early for me this morning to give me your time and kind of help educate the public, which is what I'm trying to do with this series. So Tariq, Grant, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for the platform you have and choosing to bring this topic to people. And we really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. Thank you again. And, the world needs more people like you. So we appreciate what you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show and accept the mission. Please subscribe to the Mission Zero podcast on your preferred streaming service and be sure to give us a 5-star review.